Welcome to the very first episode of my new playlist, Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm very excited today to have Joshua Bluestein, who is an attorney in the Miami office of Sidney Austin and also has a special interest in the Lodz Ghetto. Let me just say that I found him in a letter to the editor that he wrote to the Wall Street Journal recently about Hanukkah candles in the Lodz Ghetto. And before he and I really get into a conversation, he's going to explain while I'm saying Lodz, or at least trying to, and there's another pronunciation. And he's also going to give you some backstory about when Lodz was first occupied, and then we'll explain some more. So take it away, Joshua.
All right. Well, thank you, Phyllis. This is really a great honor to be on the show. Thanks for having me. So, with regards to the language question, so when you see Lodz written in Polish, it'll have an L with a line through the middle, and in the Polish language, that is pronounced as a W. So Poles will say "wódź" like that. But of course, in Hebrew and Yiddish, there's no W sound. Yemenite Hebrew, maybe, but not in the Ashkenazi tongue. So they wrote it with a lamed, which is pronounced Lodz. And I've spoken to people from the Lodz Ghetto survivors, people who are descendants of Lodz Ghetto survivors, and they say that they said it with an L sound. So the Jews said it Lodz, but the Poles said it Woods. So that could be up for debate, but I'm pretty sure that's right, and I'll be speaking as a Jew with Lodz here. So that's
Good.
that. And with regards to where Lodz is situated on the eve of World War II, I think it's important to step back a little bit and remember that after Germany was defeated in World War I, the terms of the Versailles Treaty were very punitive on Germany. Their economy was hampered by the massive reparations they had to pay to the victors, and also their military had to be very circumscribed and had to be below a certain number of soldiers and materiel. This, of course, is how Hitler rose to prominence by blaming these terms on the Jews. But the terms of the treaty did actually weaken Germany. Its economy was at a very weak period in the 1920s and early 30s, and especially with the Great Depression, it only made things worse. So Hitler said he was going to throw off the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles and bring the Jews down with it. So what does that have to do with Lodz? Well, because Germany was so weak, as Hitler tried to advance his policies, he was very concerned about world opinion. So in 1933, very early, within the first few weeks of him taking office, there's a massive boycott of German goods because of the treatment of the Jews, and it almost cripples the German economy. And Hitler has to be very concerned about how he's going to achieve his objectives. And his goal is either to win over world opinion by making them devotees of Nazism, or his belief is that Western world is so corrupted by the Jews that they're so weak and unwilling to actually take on a rising power that they're just going to appease him. And of course, we know that the appeasement is what ended up happening. So,
But not by the Jews. Just
yes, the Jews did not have a role in that, for sure not. But the West was very weak about Hitler's advances and his total violations of the Treaty of Versailles. So the first massive movement is the Anschluss, where he marches into Austria and annexes it into the Reich. And
in
then,
March 1938.
right, in March of 1938. And then also in 1938, this is the big one, was the Munich Agreement, where
In September 1938.
September of 1938, where Chamberlain goes back and said, we made peace in our time. And the thought was that Austria is essentially German, so it makes sense. And with the Munich Agreement is where Germany was given parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. And the thought was, well, those are German-speaking areas, so it makes sense, and let's just stop it there. And with this agreement, Hitler will give up his ambitions for anything further. And then in on August 23rd, you're very precise with dates, so I'll be precise. On August 23rd, 1939, Hitler makes a secret deal with the Soviets. This is the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And Molotov, whose name gets associated with the cocktail because of his attack on Finland right after this.
Oh, that I
So
didn't know. Interesting. Okay.
yes, the German bombings of Finland, so they referred to them as the Molotov cocktail. So what happens is Hitler was stepping on along, but he went as far as he could with Western approval, which was taking the Sudetenland in Austria. But and there always was the concern that if he went any farther east, that Russia would step in. And if you remember from World War One, the Russia had historically been the protector of the Slavs. Right? In the Nicky Willy correspondence in World War One, where the head of Germany and the Tsar, they're related, and the German leader says, "Well, let's not fight," and then the Tsar says, "Well, I have to join this war because I have to protect the Serbians who are our fellow Slavs." So once Germany and the Soviet Union make this deal that says that they're going to split Poland in half,
Okay, no,
and
wait. I want to verify something. I think the August 39 agreement of no aggression was actually known. The secret part was what you're about to say. Am I
exactly
correct?
right. Yes, yes, yes. Of course.
It's important only to know that suddenly in August 39, Germany and the Soviet Union have this friendship deal, which should have been a red flag, but go ahead. The
Exactly right.
secret part.
Right. So the public part is just the non-aggression, but it showed a warming of ties between these two powers. And there's a really intense picture that I welcome your listeners to go look up, which was at the 21st Zionist Congress. During that period. It was always historically in August that these were held, because the first Zionist Congress in 1897 was the last 3 days of August. So it's around this period where they have the Zionist Congress. I believe it was in Switzerland again, and it's announced that this treaty has just been made, and there's Ben Gurion and Weitzman, and their heads are down, and it's this really intense moment where you could see just the absolute despair on their faces, and because they didn't know the secret part, but they knew that this meant that Hitler was going to continue to advance. So the secret part was that they would divide Poland, and Germany would come from the west and take that half part, and the Soviet Union would come in and carve up the other half. So that's August 23rd. It takes a week for the Germans to draw up the military plan, and then on September 1st, 1939, they launch the invasion of Poland, and then Britain joins in, and you have World War II. But it was even
France
worse.
joins in too.
Yes, yes. Well, for a short
Yes.
period.
Yes. I'm just saying. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. The Allies jump in, and but by the summer of 1940, it's only England left.
Right.
So you have
France has been occupied by the Germans.
France has been occupied. Yeah, the famous picture of Hitler by the Eiffel Tower. So Germany invades on September 1st. A couple of weeks later, Russia then moves in from the east, and then the Polish army completely collapses. They can't fight both of them. So it was a total wash for the Poles. But on September 8th already, the Germans are entering Lodz. So it takes them about a week to get to the city. Almost immediately, they make life for the Jews very uncomfortable. They go into one of the cafes and round up 100 Jews and just shoot them, and things deteriorate rapidly, very quickly. The yellow Jewish star goes on, and that is, and then in December of 1939, internally, the Nazis are talking about setting up a ghetto. And then in March, they tell the Jews to start moving into what would become the ghetto area.
We're talking March 1940 now, is that right?
1940 now, yes. And there's something that was known as Bloody Thursday, where massive pogrom goes on where the Nazis slaughter a large number of Jews, which was a warning to say you better move into the ghetto area. And then in May of 1940, the ghetto was sealed, and they put up statements saying if any Jew is caught outside this area, which was fenced off and walled off, then you will be shot. And where that puts Lodz is that, and the reason I started with World War I is because, as I was saying, a lot of the German thought process was to throw off what happened in World War One. So we talked about France. So when France capitulates to Germany, Hitler actually goes to France and he signs the treaty where France surrenders in the same car that was once in a
Railroad car.
museum of France for their glory in World War One. So everything is symbolic for the Germans. And Lodz was in 1914. There was the Battle of Lodz, where the Germans occupied that area, and the German general in charge of that mission was a guy named Karl Litzmann, and therefore the Germans renamed the city of Lodz in World War II. They renamed it Lichtenstadt to show Litzmann has prevailed and we have conquered what is truly ours. And because Lodz had a sizable German speaking and ethnic German population, Lodz is actually annexed into the Reich. So it becomes Germany proper during World War II, as opposed to the other parts of Germany more east that were in what the Germans called the general government, which was just occupied Poland. But Lodz actually becomes part of Germany proper. And because of this, and because of its attempt to make it into a real German city, the ghetto becomes a very isolated place. So they make sure that there's nothing nearby. There's a huge area carved out around the ghetto, and ethnic Germans are put near the ghetto so that there aren't any Poles who might be more willing to trade or help the Jews, as opposed to in the Warsaw ghetto, where literally streets are cut in half. One part is in the ghetto, one is out. Even apartment buildings are cut up in half. One part is in the ghetto, one is out. In Lodz, because of its attempt to make it a Germified city, it's much more isolated, and they don't want it to be part of life. Whereas they don't care if it's Poles or Jews. They don't. That's not as much of a concern. So
Wait.
that's the
Okay.
long background.
Okay, that was okay. Now we want to just take a commercial break and talk about Warsaw because many people listening to this podcast will know much more about the Warsaw Ghetto, but it actually is set up afterwards. And now Warsaw is in the general government, is that correct? It's
Yes.
not. Okay. And so it's set up several months later. So even though Joshua mentioned comparing the Warsaw Ghetto, right when the Lodz Ghetto is set up, Warsaw Ghetto has not yet been set up, even though Warsaw has been bombed brutally and is occupied by the Nazis. Okay.
That's exactly right. And Warsaw is the largest ghetto at its peak. Lodz Ghetto is the second largest, and the Lodz Ghetto is the first major ghetto that is set up. There's one ghetto that's opened up in December 1939, and some other earlier ones, but those are small, just a few thousand people. Whereas the first real big, known, sizable ghetto is Lodz, and it lasts the longest. It lasts almost to the end of the war. So Lodz is really the dovetails the story of the ghettos, which is what we'll get into.
Now, who did the Germans set up to run the Lodz Ghetto for them internally?
So in most of the ghettos they set up what were called Judenrat, although because the Lodz Ghetto was actually technically in Germany proper, it wasn't a Judenrat, but it was Altensenrat, and just different terminology based on whether you were in the general government or in Germany proper. So in these places they set up these Jewish councils, and the thought was that it would be easier to get the Jews to cooperate if it was done with Jewish help, right? If a German comes and says, "Hey, come to this train," you're less likely to go. But if there's a Jew who's telling you to go along, you might be more willing. So that's the first reason of three. The second reason was that the Germans didn't really want to deal day to day with Jews. They saw it as morally corrupting of them. They thought the Jews as dirty and full of disease. So they thought it easier to have Jews deal with it. They don't want to get involved. They don't have to go into like Jewish apartments to like, look for stuff. They'd rather have Jews do that. And the third was to demoralize them, that to have the Jews participate in their own destruction was something that they thought of very highly. To see, Jews rip apart a Jewish family, for them, that was actually very uplifting in a sadistic way.
Now, there were Jewish policemen in the ghetto, but did the Germans elect, I don't know, choose the policeman, or did the Jewish council choose the policeman in Lodz?
So in Lodz, it's important to mention the character of Chaim Mordechai Rumkowski. And this man is the head of the ghetto, the elder. And the Germans appoint him due to his prior role before the war. He was involved in Jewish affairs and on the Jewish, the Kehillah, the Jewish council of the city. So they appoint him to be the head of the ghetto. But they were very careful as to who they let be around him. So they kind of, there's a purge towards the beginning of the ghetto's existence where everybody else around him is murdered. All the other people in the Jewish Council of Lodz, they are murdered. And it's a warning sign to Rumkowski that if you don't do what we say, you will be murdered as well. So that is where he comes in. And his mentality is that the Germans are going to eradicate us unless we become valuable to their war effort. And to that end, the Germans extend him a loan in 1940, and he uses that to build up factories and workshops and armament creation units, and he mobilizes the ghetto into this massive armament creation for the Germans, uniforms and all sorts of other things. So, and in a way that quote unquote works, because when the Germans are later talking about destroying the ghettos, the Lodz ghetto lasts much longer because they are saying to each other that it's really going to mess up the war effort if this ghetto is destroyed. And personally, some of the leaders were making amazing amounts of money personally, like they were
I mean,
just,
the Nazi leaders.
yeah, the Nazi leaders were just taking tons of money and really making a huge killing off of it, in two ways, I guess. And therefore, it lasts to the end. They weren't the only ones who did that. So Rumkowski has these like devotees in other ghettos. Moshe Marin in the Sosnowitz ghetto, he actually goes on like a diplomatic mission to Lodz in 1942 to see how Rumkowski runs things. But that doesn't, last as long, and eventually him and the ghetto is liquidated. So people try to do what he does, but because of the ghetto's size and its productive output, it lasts lasts a lot longer. And yes, there were Jewish police. They were treated much better by the Germans. They got better rations and living quarters. But of course, it was very tough work to have to round up people and of course there was some corruption in the Jewish administration that was true in a lot of the ghettos. And there was kind of a divide between some of the rank and file of the ghetto who looked at disdain with those who they thought were working on behalf of the Germans and making getting more food and things like that. So it did create some tension in the ghetto, but even still the Germans made sure to remember who was boss. And there's a great picture, great in like a really sad way, but there's the wall of the ghetto and there's the Jewish police on the inside and there's the German police on the outside. And this picture it shows the Germans laughing while the Jewish police are in their knees in the snow and they're just taunting them. So there was no place in the ghetto where it wasn't going to be tough, but that's in a way how it shook out.
Can we talk about, I don't know if this is in food rations, because I'm just thinking of one of the diaries from Lodz, I think it's Lodz that I read recently. I don't understand whether in the ghetto, did they have like pieces of paper and they lined up every day? How did food rations work?
Yeah, so food wise, with all ghettos, the food situation was terrible. when a historian mentions how only about 40 to 60% of the daily caloric intake necessary for the human organism to survive was given to the Jews of the ghetto. So starvation is just absolutely horrendous
And
and
planned.
deliberately planned. And more than that, starvation was always they would decrease the food allotments, the Germans would, before deportations out to the concentration camps and to the gas chambers, because if the Jews were so starving, they would often motivate them to show up to the trains by saying, "If you show up, we'll give you a piece of bread." So they would. So actually, starvation was worse before the massive deportation actions, and the way it was distributed was usually they would get their allotments to last them. The main ration allotment would last them for 14 days. It would vary, maybe 12, 14, 15, but it was supposed to, you get like your big allotment of bread and sugar and potatoes, and it was supposed to last you for about 2 weeks. And what this meant was that you were starving and you had all this food in front of you. And the temptation to not just gorge yourself right there was so strong. And in the Ghetto Diaries, you'll see where someone is just so hungry and they can't hold it and they just eat all their food. And then they just know that they are doomed and they will die in the next 2 weeks. So, or they'll try to trade or something like that. But I spoke to Lodz Ghetto survivors recently, and they remember that you gotta just don't eat it all. Try to cut it out, cut it into pieces the last 14 days. But there were some lining up for daily rations. If you were a worker, you would get a soup usually in the factory, so you would have your daily soup.
Let's just make it clear. We're not talking kind of soup that we think is soup. This
Yes,
was
yes. We're not talking about like a nice split pea or a
right,
good or a good hearty
right.
Campbell soup or chicken soup. We're talking it was called resort soup for a reason, because it was the resort being the name of the factories. Like the factories were called that. But it was basically like it wasn't soup. It was just a watery consomme essentially. So yeah, so starvation is terrible. And just to add one story about how really terrible this is. So when the gassing operations begin, there are not gas chambers yet. There are just gas vans. And the
So wait, when is this? Can you give us a little story?
this is in January of 1942 when the gassing operations begin.
Wait, can
Uh,
I say one thing for people like me who love to put things in context?
yes,
January 20th, 1942 was the infamous Wannsee Conference, in which the head Nazis met in a suburb of Berlin and just talked about the final solution, which I mean had already been decided, in which, for those of you who don't know this, Eichmann, who took notes, drew up the list of 11 million Jews that would be murdered. This included the countries like England and Ireland, etc., that hadn't yet been occupied. So the fact that, as Joshua just pointed out, that this took place in January 42 probably was connected to that conference. I mean, I'm just guessing. Okay, go ahead,
yeah,
Joshua.
that's exactly right. So the Wannsee Conference is January 20th, 1942. And the gassing operations in Lodz, the deportations begin January 16th. So, so there is this notion, right, that this is starting. So we got to figure out what's our long-term game plan. So the Jews of the Lodz Ghetto are some of the first to be sent to the gas vans. So there aren't set up gas chambers yet. They're just vans on wheels that they would pack the Jews into the back of, and the driver would drive it into the forest. And in the time that it took for them to get there, the gas would go in, and then Jews would have to pull them out of the
Other
van
Jews, right?
and bury them. So this happened in Chelmno, and in Chelmno, the one of these people whose job it is to bury the bodies, or to burn the bodies and to cavity search them for goods and look in their teeth for gold teeth. That whole horrible affair is what someone escapes, and the guy who escapes is Lama Weiner, and he writes the Grajanowski report, which is his pen name, and he writes about what happened in this forest with their gassing bodies and this and what was happening. And he manages to make it to the Warsaw Ghetto. And there in the Warsaw Ghetto, he distributes this and it makes it into the Oyneg Shabbos archive, which it's now called the Grajanowski report. And in this report, he talks about seeing the bodies of the Lodz Ghetto people who were gassed in January of 1942. And though he was burying other bodies from other places, he says that when the Lodz Ghetto bodies showed up, they were so emaciated and so skin and bones that it shocked him and the other people who were burying the bodies. So this just shows you how tremendous the starvation was in the ghetto, where it's noticeable to someone in that state. So that is where the ghetto situates itself in terms of survival. And of course, it was not very good. Survival was difficult within the ghetto itself. Around 43,000 Jews died in the ghetto itself. Of course, another 145,000 will be murdered in the concentration camps. But in the ghetto itself, 43 to around 1,000 Jews are dead.
And can I add that and you'll correct me, much for the starvation, we can't forget the cruelty of the Nazi soldiers who just shot people on the street, and this is
Yeah,
mentioned in some of the diaries, for
of
various.
course, of course. But often actually in some of the ghetto administration, when they have to put the cause of death, sometimes they just put ghetto or like general ghetto disease, because it's so hard to know, right? Is it starvation? Is it some other cause that's linked to starvation because your immune system is so suppressed? So yeah, sometimes it's just straight shootings and things like that. But when you're so malnourished, all sorts of other things will come and kill you. So that's the ghetto.
So we have about 10 minutes left. I mean, we could go on for hours, but what other main things should people know? A, to understand the horrific conditions, that a ghetto was not just an isolated place that functioned like, a neighborhood. It just, you couldn't leave it. And also, when was the Lodz Ghetto closed? And tell us that ending story.
So we can definitely go on more than 10 minutes because I have more than 10 minutes of things to say. We haven't really even scratched the surface, so happy to go much longer. But so the ghettos are in Eastern Europe are mostly dissolved of by 1940, by the middle of 1943. Lodz Ghetto lasts until the end of August of 1944. So August 29th, 1944, that is when the last trains leave the ghetto. But the Germans keep around 500 Jews to help clean up the ghetto and do things like that. So those Jews stay until the Russians come liberated in January of 1945, and with other about 800, a total of the number is 877 Jews. Some 500 of the ones who were part of this cleanup crew, and then another 377 who were in hiding are there at the end. So that's the way the ghetto ends. But what I think is important to remember about the ghetto and why the Lodz Ghetto is particularly interesting and valuable from a historical standpoint is that it's the last, and I mean the last, living portion of Eastern European Ashkenazi life that exists, because everything else is destroyed. And there's just this island of the Lodz Ghetto that is still living in somewhat of a normal life in terms of like they're still speaking Yiddish, they're still living in houses, in apartments, and they're still living with their families, ones who haven't been deported yet, and there's still the cultural aspects and the religious and the services and the cantors and all of that is like still happening, and it's happening nowhere else. But there's a novel called The Lost Shtetl by Max Gross, if you've seen it. And in this book, the novelist describes how there's this shtetl so remote in the forests of Eastern Europe that the Nazis miss it. Everyone just doesn't know it's there, and they emerge in the modern period, and they're just totally untouched. and they're like a living vestige of what life was like before the Nazis decimated it, and it goes into that whole story. But the Lost Ghetto is basically like the Lodz Ghetto. It's the final state, the great period of 1,000 years of Eastern European Yiddish Jewish life ends when with with the Lodz Ghetto. The Lodz Ghetto is the last place that is still keeping that alive. And to quote Abraham Joshua Heschel, when he writes about the Jews of Eastern Europe, he says, quote, "In this period, our people attained the highest degree of inwardness. It was the golden period in Jewish history, in the history of the Jewish soul." And for the Lodz to be the last practitioners of this way of life is just so powerful. And what's crazy is that they don't know it. And at the end of May 1944, there are documents that have been found that were written by the Polish Jewish underground, the partisans. And they know that there are still 80,000 Jews in Lodz. And they say, and they write, quote, "The Lodz ghetto is hermetically sealed. Despite our many efforts to make contact with the Lodz Jews, we have failed to make our way into the ghetto. It is an island, totally cut off from the rest of the world. All other cities in this country are already Judenrein, free of Jews." So that is where, when you're reading, especially the last few months of the ghetto, you realize that all of the amazing parts that we love about the old world, that is, its last gasps are here. And they don't even know it. It's kind of the inverse of the Jews of Belmonte, who were the Portuguese conversos, who they're living in the hills of Portugal, and they think that they're the last Jews. But in fact, there are actually all these Jews all around the world. The Lodz Ghetto Jews think that there are all these Jews in Poland and their brothers and sisters around them, but they don't realize that it's totally gone. And you could see this in a Ghetto Chronicle entry from Yom Kippur 1943, where they write, "Though the ghetto has been fasting excessively for years, most of the populace will fast voluntarily on Yom Kippur. Indeed, the ghetto as a whole looks much the same as it always does, but the Yom Kippur atmosphere has magically evoked a bit of the Jewish beauty that is still alive somewhere outside amongst our brothers and sisters." And they're talking about like the other Jews of Poland. They don't realize that they're cut off. And this was crazy, is why the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto and other ghettos launch revolts, because they realize what's going on and where these trains are headed. But the Lodz Ghetto is so cut off, as I said, because it's part of the Reich, and there isn't there isn't as much underground material, that they just don't know where things are headed. So I guess with the last few minutes, I would just like to talk about some of these moments of glory where the Jews show the beauty of this life that was totally snuffed out. And so an example of that is in Passover of 1942. This is April 1942. A Seder is held.
Wait, can we put it in context? The Warsaw Ghetto was Pesach the following year, right? 1943.
Yes,
Am I right?
yes.
Okay.
1 year later, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the first night, starts the first night of Pesach, 1943. So this is in the Lodz Ghetto a year before. And it's just to show you the depth of the Jewishness and the beauty of the Jewishness of this civilization of Ashkenazi life that was totally snuffed out. So and are we going to go over a little more, another 10 minutes?
Yes, yes.
So here he's talking about a ghetto, and the rabbi who we'll be talking about is this Rabbi Krakauer, who's blind. He's his beloved blind rabbi, and this is his last Passover. He is Gas at Chelmno the same year. So this is his last moment. And this now I'm quoting from Oscar Rosenfeld, who I quoted in the Wall Street Journal piece. He is an Austrian slash Czech Jew, and he is actually an early Zionist. He's a confidant of Herzl and of Jabotinsky, and he is writing what happened at the Seder. The rabbi leads the Seder, gives a sermon, festive mood. "Ata bachartanu, you have chosen us. And Zecher l'tzias Mitzrayim, remember the exodus from Egypt. Wonderful is the strength to believe in the coming of the Messiah amidst this misery. He will lead us out. This is the bread of affliction which we eat. Matzah is made of dark flour, so stiff it's hard to chew and won't even soften when dipped in hot liquid. A sermon about Eretz Yisrael where we will all end up. The next day, a few boys are pulling a cart with junk. Here's the big moment. A few older Jews are looking on. One of the boys says, without moving a face muscle, so to speak, in remembrance of the reading of the Haggadah the night before, quote, not one rose against us, but in every generation they rose to destroy us, and he, the Blessed One, saved us each time with an outstretched arm. But one of the Jews, a redhead, says, had he left us in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, we would now be sitting in a hotel in Cairo drinking Turkish coffee. He laughs. So does the man next to him. Then that one, a gray-haired man, says, Moses knew what he was doing. Had we stayed in Mitzrayim, we shouldn't have been blessed with receiving the Torah. And what did the Torah get us? Nothing but unpleasantness, suffering, persecution. Someone else said, but also a pleasant time, the most beautiful time. Without Torah, no life. I never cared for the flesh pots of Egypt, and so I don't miss them as much as so many here. Hunger, so one goes hungry. Getting beaten, so one gets beaten. We are, like it or not, the Am Segula, the chosen nation. Nothing can be done about it. We are chosen. We took the task upon ourselves. And when we are called up to fight, we will fight. For the time being, is not possible. He goes on. And then he says, this is the great conclusion. Just look at the boys, how patiently they are pulling the cart. Not one of them is willing to give up what he received at birth. Tell any one of them to go change and merge with another people, and he will answer, no. He holds fast to the bris, to the covenant. For the Eternal made the covenant not only with our fathers' fathers, he made it with us too, and will make it with the next generation, and so on, into all eternity. Do you want to exclude yourself? So another line from the Haggadah. Should we want to be smarter than our ancestors? They went into the fire. For us who are alive today, and our children here we don't want to be smarter, and our children here won't want to be smarter than us, their fathers. This is how it will go from generation to generation. I mean, this is the kind of just amazing, and it's not performative. This is so in the bones of the people who are in the ghetto. And another unbelievable moment is in March of 1943. There's a deportation out of the ghetto, and I'm reading now from Rosenfeld's diary. 20 freight cars are already made for deporting the approximately 1,000 people, many with lung ailments, unknown where to. Horrifying scene in the prison. A group of younger people loaded onto the wagon, taken to the collection camp. Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of the name, singing Hatikva. They were singing in the greatest anguish a little piece of hope out of their soul. Auto de fe of the Spanish Inquisition was child's play compared to this ordeal. So you have these Jews going to be deported, and they're singing Hatikva onto the train. The Jewish hope continues. And one thing I have to make your listeners know, because this is titled Things You Don't Know About the Holocaust. This is such an amazing moment, and no one's ever written or spoken about it, but I saw it in Rosenfeld's diary, that is absolutely miraculous and breathtaking. So Rosenfeld in his diary usually dates things in the English date, but he only very infrequently, and in this time, puts the Hebrew date, the 6th of ER, and this is 1944, April 29th. And it's a scene that no student of history should overlook. So he describes how people got together in the ghetto and decided to have a quiet assembly to make a declaration to assert to themselves belief in the Jewish people's future and their ability to, that this was just, just like let's get together and have some solidarity and belief in the Jewish future. And he is quoting now. Shaik speaks about the idea that had carried him along through 4 years in the ghetto to this day. Everybody had this sense of historical hours, of a historical place. On the horizon, a soft, rosy band. This is how it appeared to my friends. And faith in a speedy Yeshia, Mehera b'yameinu, salvation, speedily in our day. So what's crazy about this moment? And that he put on the 6th of ER. So this is the guy talking about how his belief in the coming salvation helped him survive the last 4 years. Well, what happened exactly 4 years forward on the 6th of ER. That's the founding of the state of Israel. I mean, is that not unbelievable?
Yes, that's really
That's
amazing.
unbelievable. So I don't know why they chose that day, why he decided to write the 6th of ER. I don't know if Rosenfeld was some sort of prophet, but just that they get together to talk about how the last 4 years is still a sign that they believe in the salvation of the Jews. And then exactly 4 years later, the four and the four, the day, this is the middle point. It's just unbelievable. And you've been very uh, tough with me about dates, so I'll be sure to be even clearer. The sharp listener will say, but the 5th of ER is Israeli Independence Day. So why are you saying the 6th? Well, yes, they declared independence on the 5th of ER, but they did so on the eve of Sabbath when it was still uh, the 5th of ER and it was still light out. But when they declared independence, it wasn't immediate. They said that they declare independence when the British leave, and the British said that they were leaving on at midnight on that day. So actually, the Jewish calendar, independence actually took effect on the 6th of ER. So this moment is just incredible, and I don't want to make it seem like these were just superhuman automatons who are just like miracle believers. This was not easy for them to believe. Rosenfeld has another quote where earlier in the Ghetto, he writes how when someone says, quote, only a miracle can save us, others present will shake their heads and make a gesture that means, quote, nothing. Long live the devil. We no longer believe in redemption. We no longer believe in miracles. So people in the Ghetto were very much destroyed by spiritually and morally for what was happening. But and this goes back to the Heschel quote, just the unbelievable society that pre-war and middle of the war Jewish life in Poland was that despite this, they could still they had this internal engine of Jewishness that allowed them to persevere through these moments. And this just goes on throughout the Ghetto. Like in September and in February of 1944, this was one of the worst economic periods in the Ghetto. In my work, I've shown how this was a hyperinflation, and so when things are getting extra bad economically for them and food wise, the workers of the electrical engineering department joined together to create a self-help program. And the Chronicle quotes how workers of the electrical engineering department have joined together in a sort of self-help program. After soup has been distributed, they gather around a collective pot and each contributes 2 spoonfuls of soup and a piece of potato from his own bowl. The 10 bowls of soup thus accumulated are then donated to the weak and the ailing fellow workers. Again, the Jewish solidarity. I mean, today we all live in our separate communities. Whatever you look like or whatever you believe, you kind of like go into your own place and that's who you are with. But like this light is so intertwined. All these different people are coming together just to help their fellow Jews. Well, I mean, we could totally learn from this. But what I want to make the point is that though this life has been destroyed, this civilization, it's not we still have a continuity, and I think that is the state of Israel. Because as I've shown several times, that when they are in the depth of despair, their thought is, we can bear this because we know at the end there is a redemption. Something will happen that is going to bring us out of this, and that is what Israel represents today. So we're in this thread, and I see this so much when I study the Ghetto because in one of the diaries of Henrik Fogel. So I read through the diary and then I flip to the next page and it's Henrik Fogel in an IDF uniform in 1949. And this is the taking those principles of things that we've discussed and literally he leaves and goes right to join the IDF in its fight for independence. This is the Jewish story. Though this life is destroyed, it's not like Atlantis or Rome, where we could learn maybe some things from it by studying history books. There's a continuity, this Jewishness, this Jewish solidarity, this belief in the importance of what the Jewish people have to offer. That continues, and that still exists today, and that are just a few of, I think, some very telling moments of the ghetto that I don't think people necessarily may have known about. But what makes it even scarier, these moments, is that they are the last. Like when this moment is happening in 1944, there's nowhere else where this is going on. The Jews of Hungary are still, some of them are still there, but actually, if you want to think about really what is the swan song, what is the last moment of the 1,000-year reign of Jewish life in Poland that we all love so much. What is the last moment? It might be what, amongst these Jews who are in the ghetto after it's liquidated, who are there to clean up the ghetto. There is there are two moments in the holiday season of 1944. So this is September and October of 1944. So Jacob Poznansky, who is in hiding in the ghetto, he reports in his diary, he survives, but he reports in his diary how in September 19th, 1944, he writes how the least murmur so upsets us that we've become watchful, frightened animals. When will we be human again? So they can't make a sound because they're so worried about being caught. But then 2 days later, he writes, yesterday, a hiding place was uncovered. 8 people were caught. One got away. It was a well-camouflaged shelter on the border of the ghetto. They gave themselves away by singing Rosh Hashanah prayers. A Shupo policeman passing by on the other side of the barbed wire heard them and notified the station. So he's so worried about being quiet, and these Jews probably felt the same way, but they just couldn't contain themselves. They wanted to feel that Jewishness again, so they just bursted out in prayers. I mean, I wish they hadn't, but it just shows that it just shows so much of what we've lost. But the last moment, I think, the real last moment of Ashkenazi Jewish life is what happens on October 7th of 1944. It's Sukkot.
which is
And
okay, just a strange date when you just said October
yes,
7th,
100%.
1944. Okay, keep going.
Exactly. And he writes, and this is Poznansky again. He writes, Jews all over the world are celebrating Sukkot. Here, our friends have made a sukkah within the shop area where some religious friends eat their meager meal. It's hard to believe the sacrifices Jews make to keep up age-old traditions. They erect a sukkah within the vanished ghetto, where even the presence of unofficially housed Jews is punished by death. So this is the last moment. I mean, within a couple of months, the Germans flee and the Soviets come in, and like this is the last moment of that civilization. And so I think for people with a sense of historical timing, this is like the rigor mortis of that existence. And it's so sad how it ended. But I think that when I spoke about the Sixth of ER meeting, that gala that occurred in the ghetto, I think summarizes so much of where I think the Lodz Ghetto comes on, which is that yes, everything was destroyed, but there is this continuity, and I think that is Israel today. And and yeah, happy to answer any other questions. I can go as long as you would like.
Well, what I'm thinking is to have you back in a few weeks because there are all these questions I want to ask. But I like to keep these to a certain length so that people will listen to the whole episode. And I think that you've really been amazing in giving us some considerable, not just historic information, but things to think about, particularly in this very difficult time for Israel now. So for now, I want to thank you, Joshua, so much. I want to thank the listeners, and I hope they'll share this with their friends and colleagues. And in terms of the victims of the Holocaust, the rescuers, the upstanders rather than the bystanders, I want to say, may their memories be for a blessing forever.